Chapter 12, Part 2 of The Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1760 to 1783, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The battle forced the English to remain inactive for 6 weeks, till the Monmouth was repaired. Unfortunately, Suffren's situation did not allow him to assume the offensive at once. He was short of men, provisions, and especially of spare spars and rigging. In an official letter after the action, he wrote, "I have no spare stores to repair rigging. The squadron lacks at least 12 spare topmasts. A convoy of supply ships was expected at Point de Galle, which, with the rest of Ceylon, except Trincomalee, was still Dutch. He therefore anchored at Batacalo, south of Trincomalee, a position in which he was between Hughes and outward bound English ships, and was favorably placed to protect his own convoys, which joined him there." On the 3rd of June he sailed for Tranquebar, a Danish possession, where he remained 2 or 3 weeks, harassing the English communications between Madras and the fleet at Trincomalee. Leaving there, he sailed for Cuddalore to communicate with the commander of the land forces and Hyder Ali. The latter was found to be much discontented with the scanty cooperation of the French general. Suffren, however, had won his favor, and he expressed a wish to see him on his return from the expedition then in contemplation; for, true to his accurate instinct, the commodore was bent upon again seeking out the English fleet, after beating which he intended to attack Negapatam. There was not in him any narrowness of professional prejudice. He kept always in view the necessity, both political and strategic, of nursing the alliance with the Sultan, and establishing control upon the seaboard and in the interior; but he clearly recognized that the first step thereto was the control of the sea, by disabling the English fleet. The tenacity and vigor with which he followed this aim, amid great obstacles, joined to the clear-sightedness with which he saw it, are the distinguishing merits of Suffren amid the crowd of French fleet commanders, his equals in courage, but trammelled by the bonds of a false tradition and the perception of a false objective. Hughes, meantime, having rigged jury masts to the Monmouth, had gone to Trincomalee, where his squadron refitted and the sick were landed for treatment; but it is evident, as has before been mentioned, that the English had not held the port long enough to make an arsenal or supply port; for he says, "I will be able to remast the Monmouth from the spare stores on board the several ships." His resources were nevertheless superior to those of his adversary. During the time that Suffren was at Tranquebar, worrying the English communications between Madras and Trincomalee, Hughes still stayed quietly in the latter port, sailing for Negapatam on the 23rd of June, the day after Suffren reached Cuddalore. The two squadrons had thus again approached each other, and Suffren hastened his preparations for attack as soon as he heard that his enemy was where he could get at him. Hughes awaited his movement. Before sailing, however, Suffren took occasion to say in writing home: "Since my arrival in Ceylon, partly by the help of the Dutch, partly through the prizes we have taken, the squadron has been equipped for 6 months' service, and I have rations of wheat and rice assured for more than a year." This achievement was indeed a just source of pride and of self-congratulation. Without a port and destitute of resources, the French commodore had lived off the enemy; the stores, ships, and commerce of the latter had supplied his wants. To his fertility of resource and the activity of his cruisers, inspired by himself, this result was due. Yet he had but 2 frigates, the class of vessel upon which an admiral must mainly depend for this predatory warfare. On the 23rd of March both provisions and stores had been nearly exhausted. $6,000 in money and the provisions in the convoy were then his sole resources. Since then he had fought a severe action, most expensive in rigging and men, as well as in ammunition. After that fight of April 12 he had left only powder and shot enough for one other battle of equal severity. 3 months later he was able to report as above, that he could keep the sea on his station for 6 months without further supplies. This result was due wholly to himself, to his self-reliance, and what may without exaggeration be called his greatness of soul. It was not expected at Paris; on the contrary, it was expected there that the squadron would return to the Isle of France to refit. It was not thought possible that it could remain on a hostile coast, so far from its nearest base, and be kept in efficient condition. Suffren thought otherwise. He considered, with true military insight and a proper sense of the value of his own profession, that the success of the operations in India depended upon the control of the sea, and therefore upon the uninterrupted presence of his squadron. He did not shrink from attempting that which had always been thought impossible. This firmness of spirit, bearing the stamp of genius, must, to be justly appreciated, be considered with reference to the circumstances of his own time and of the preceding generations in which he grew up. Suffren was born July 17, 1729, and served during the wars of 1739 and 1756. He was first under fire at Matthews's action off Toulon, February 22, 1744. He was the contemporary of d'Estaing, de Guichen, and de Grasse, before the days of the French Revolution, when the uprising of a people had taught men how often impossibilities are not impossible; before Napoleon and Nelson had made a mock of the word. His attitude and action had therefore at the time the additional merit of originality, but his lofty temper was capable of yet higher proof. Convinced of the necessity of keeping the squadron on its station, he ventured to disregard not only the murmurs of his officers, but the express orders of the court. When he reached Batacalo, he found dispatches directing him to return to the Isle of France. Instead of taking them as a release from the great burden of responsibility, he disobeyed, giving his reasons, and asserting that he on the spot could judge better than a minister in Europe what the circumstances demanded. Such a leader deserved better subordinates and a better colleague than he had in the command of the forces on shore. Whether or no the conditions of the general maritime struggle would have permitted the overthrow of the English East Indian power may be doubtful, but it is certain that among all the admirals of the three nations there was none so fitted to accomplish that result as Suffren. We shall find him enduring severer tests and always equal to them. In the afternoon of the 5th of July, Suffren's squadron came in sight of the English, anchored off Cuddalore. An hour later a sudden squall carried away the main and mizzen topmasts of one of the French ships. Admiral Hughes got under way, and the two fleets manoeuvred during the night. The following day the wind favored the English, and the opponents found themselves in line of battle on the starboard tack, heading south-southeast, with the wind at southwest. The disabled French ship, having by unpardonable inactivity failed to repair her injuries, the numbers about to engage were equal, 11 on each side. At 11 A.M. the English bore down together and engaged ship after ship; but, as was usual under those conditions, the rear ships did not come to as close action as those ahead of them. Captain Chevalier carefully points out that their failure was a fair offset to the failure of the French rear on the 12th of April, but fails to note in this connection that the French van, both on that occasion and again on the 3d of September, bungled as well as the rear. There can remain little doubt in the mind of a careful reader that most of the French captains were inferior as seamen to their opponents. During this part of the engagement, the fourth ship in the French order, the "Brilliant," lost her mainmast, bore up out of the line, and dropped gradually astern and to leeward. At 1 P.M., when the action was hottest, the wind suddenly shifted to south-southeast, taking the ships on the port bow. Four English ships, the Burford, Sultan, Worcester, and Eagle, seeing the breeze coming, kept off to port toward the French line. The others were taken aback and paid off to starboard. The French ships, on the other hand, with two exceptions, the Brilliant and Sévère, paid off from the English. The effect of the change of wind was therefore to separate the main parts of the two squadrons, but to bring together between the lines four English and two French ships. Technical order was destroyed. The Brilliant, having dropped far astern of her position, came under the fire of two of the English rear, the Worcester and the Eagle, who had kept off in time, and so neared the French. Suffren in person came to her assistance and drove off the English, who were also threatened by the approach of two other French ships that had warned to the westward in obedience to signal. While this partial action was taking place, the other endangered French ship, the Sévère, was engaged by the English Sultan, and, if the French captain, M. de Cillart, can be believed, by two other English ships. It is probable, from her place in the line, that the Burford also assailed her. However this may be, the Sévère hauled down her flag, but while the Sultan was wearing away from her, she resumed her fire, raking the English ship. The order to surrender, given by the French captain and carried into execution by the formal, well-established token of submission, was disregarded by his subordinates, who fired upon their enemy while the flag was down. In effect, the action of the French ship amounted to using an infamous ruse de guerre; but it would be unjust to say that this was intended. The positions of the different vessels were such that the Sultan could not have secured her prize. Other French ships were approaching and must have retaken it. The indignation of the French juniors at the weakness of their captain was therefore justified. Their refusal to be bound by it may be excused to men face to face with an unexpected question of propriety, in the heat of battle and under the sting of shame. Nevertheless, scrupulous good faith would seem to demand that their deliverance should be awaited from other hands, not bound by the action of their commander, or at least that the forbearing assailant should not have suffered from them. The captain, suspended and sent home by Suffren and cashiered by the king, utterly condemned himself by his attempted defence. When Captain de Cillart saw the French squadron drawing off, for all the ships except the Brilliant had fallen off on the other tack, he thought it useless to prolong his defence, and had the flag hauled down. The ships engaged with him immediately ceased their fire, and the one on the starboard side moved away. At this moment the Sévère fell off to starboard and her sails filled. Captain de Cillart then ordered the fire to be resumed by his lower deck guns, the only one still manned, and he rejoined his squadron. This action was the only one of the five fought by Suffren on the coast of India in which the English admiral was the assailant. There can be found in it no indication of military conceptions of tactical combinations; but on the other hand Hughes is continually showing the aptitudes, habits of thought, and foresight of the skilful seaman, as well as the courage beyond all proof. He was in truth an admirable representative of the average English naval officer of the middle of the 18th century; and while it is impossible not to condemn the general ignorance of the most important part of the profession, it is yet useful to remark how far thorough mastery of its other details and dogged determination not to yield made up for so signal a defect. As the Roman legions often redeemed the blunders of their generals, so did English captains and seamen often save that which had been lost by the errors of their admirals, errors which neither captain nor seaman recognized, nor would probably have admitted. Nowhere were these solid qualities so clearly shown as in Suffren's battles, because nowhere else were such demands made upon them. No more magnificent instances of desperate yet useful resistance to overwhelming odds are to be found in naval annals than that of the Monmouth on April 12 and of the Exeter on February 17. An incident told of the latter ship is worth quoting. At the heel of the action, when the Exeter was already in the state of a wreck, the master came to Commodore King to ask him what he should do with the ship, as two of the enemy were again bearing down upon her. He laconically answered, "There is nothing to be done but to fight her till she sinks." She was saved. Suffren, on the contrary, was by this time incensed beyond endurance by the misbehavior of his captains. Cillart was sent home, but besides him 2 others, both of them men of influential connections, and one a relative of Suffren himself, were dispossessed of their commands. However necessary and proper this step, few but Suffren would have had the resolution to take it; for so far as he then knew, he was only a captain in rank, and it was not permitted even to admirals to deal thus with their juniors. "You may perhaps be angry, Monseigneur," he wrote, "that I have not used rigor sooner; but I beg you to remember that the regulations do not give this power even to a general officer, which I am not." It is immediately after the action of the 6th of July that Suffren's superior energy and military capacity begin markedly to influence the issue between himself and Hughes. The tussle had been severe, but military qualities began to tell, as they surely must. The losses of the 2 squadrons in men in the last action had been as 1-3 in favor of the English. On the other hand, the latter had apparently suffered more in sails and spars, in motive power. Both fleets anchored in the evening, the English off Negapatam, the French to leeward off Cuddalore. On the 18th of July, Suffren was again ready for sea, whereas on the same day Hughes had but just decided to go to Madras to finish his repairs. Suffren was further delayed by the political necessity of an official visit to Hyder Ali, after which he sailed to Batacalo, arriving there on the 9th of August to await reinforcements and supplies from France. On the 21st these joined him, and 2 days later he sailed, now with 14 ships of the line, for Trincomalee, anchoring off the town on the 25th. The following night the troops were landed, batteries thrown up, and the attack pressed with vigor. On the 30th and 31st the 2 forts which made the defensive strength of the place surrendered, and this all-important port passed into the hands of the French. Convinced that Hughes would soon appear, Suffren granted readily all the honors of war demanded by the governor of the place, contenting himself with the substantial gain. 2 days later, on the evening of September 2d, the English fleet was sighted by the French lookout frigates. During the 6 weeks in which Suffren had been so actively and profitably employed, the English admiral had remained quietly at anchor, repairing and refitting. No precise information is available for deciding how far this delay was unavoidable, but having in view the well-known aptitude of English seamen of that age, it can scarcely be doubted that, had Hughes possessed the untiring energy of his great rival, he could have gained the few days which decided the fate of Trincomalee, and fought a battle to save the place. In fact, this conclusion is supported by his own reports, which state that on the 12th of August the ships were nearly fitted, and yet, though apprehending an attack on Trincomalee, he did not sail until the 20th. The loss of this harbor forced him to abandon the east coast, which was made unsafe by the approach of the northeast monsoon, and conferred an important strategic advantage upon Suffren, not to speak of the political effect upon the native rulers in India. To appreciate thoroughly this contrast between the two admirals, it is necessary also to note how differently they were situated with regard to material for repairs. After the action of the 6th, Hughes found at Madras spars, cordage, stores, provisions, and material. Suffren at Cuddalore found nothing. To put his squadron in good fighting condition, 19 new topmasts were needed, besides lower masts, yards, rigging, sails, and so on. To take the sea at all, the masts were removed from the frigates and smaller vessels and given to the ships of the line, while English prizes were stripped to equip the frigates. Ships were sent off to the Straits of Malacca to procure other spars and timber. Houses were torn down on shore to find lumber for repairing the hulls. The difficulties were increased by the character of the anchorage, an open roadstead with frequent heavy sea, and by the near presence of the English fleet; but the work was driven on under the eyes of the commander in chief, who, like Lord Howe at New York, inspired the working parties by his constant appearance among them. Notwithstanding his prodigious obesity, Suffren displayed the fiery ardor of youth. He was everywhere where work was going on. Under his powerful impulse, the most difficult tasks were done with incredible rapidity. Nevertheless, his officers represented to him the bad state of the fleet and the need of a port for the ships of the line. "Until we have taken Trincomalee," he replied, "the open roadsteads of the Coromandel coast will answer." It was indeed to this activity on the Coromandel coast that the success at Trincomalee was due. The weapons with which Suffren fought are obsolete, but the results wrought by his tenacity and fertility in resources are among the undying lessons of history. While the characters of the two chiefs were thus telling upon the strife in India, other no less lasting lessons were being afforded by the respective governments at home, who did much to restore the balance between them. While the English ministry, after the news of the battle of Porto Praya, fitted out in November, 1781, a large and compact expedition, convoyed by a powerful squadron of 6 ships of the line under the command of an active officer, to reinforce Hughes, the French despatched comparatively scanty succors in small detached bodies, relying apparently upon secrecy rather than upon force to assure their safety. Thus Suffren, while struggling with his innumerable embarrassments, had the mortification of learning that now one and now another of the small detachments sent to his relief were captured or driven back to France before they were clear of European waters. There was in truth little safety for small divisions north of the Straits of Gibraltar. Thus the advantages gained by his activity were in the end sacrificed. Up to the fall of Trincomalee the French were superior at sea, but in the 6 months which followed the balance turned the other way, by the arrival of the English reinforcements under Sir Richard Bickerton. With his usual promptness, the French commodore had prepared for further immediate action as soon as Trincomalee surrendered. The cannon and men landed from the ships were at once re-embarked, and the port secured by a garrison strong enough to relieve him of any anxiety about holding it. This great seaman, who had done as much in proportion to the means entrusted to him as any known to history, and had so signally illustrated the sphere and influence of naval power, had no intention of fettering the movements of his fleet, or risking his important conquest by needlessly taking upon the shoulders of the ships the burden of defending a seaport. When Hughes appeared, it was past the power of the English fleet by a single battle to reduce the now properly garrisoned post. Doubtless a successful campaign, by destroying or driving away the French sea power, would achieve this result; but Suffren might well believe that, whatever mishaps might arise on a single day, he could in the long run more than hold his own with his opponent. Seaports should defend themselves. The sphere of the fleet is on the open sea; its object offence rather than defence, its objective the enemy's shipping wherever it can be found. Suffren now saw again before him the squadron on which depended the English control of the sea. He knew that powerful reinforcements to it must arrive before the next season, and he hastened to attack. Hughes, mortified by his failure to arrive in time, for a drawn battle beforehand would have saved what a successful battle afterward could not regain, was in no humor to balk him. Still, with sound judgment, he retreated to the southeast, flying in good order, to use Suffren's expression, regulating speed by the slowest ships, and steering many different courses, so that the chase, which began at daybreak, overtook the enemy only at 2 in the afternoon. The object of the English was to draw Suffren so far to leeward of the port that, if his ships were disabled, he could not easily regain it. The French numbered 14 ships of the line to 12 English. This superiority, together with his sound appreciation of the military situation in India, increased Suffren's natural eagerness for action; but his ships sailed badly and were poorly handled by indifferent and dissatisfied men. These circumstances, during the long and vexatious pursuit, chafed and fretted the hot temper of the commodore, which still felt the spur of urgency that for 2 months had quickened the operations of the squadron. Signal followed signal, manoeuvre succeeded manoeuvre, to bring his disordered vessels into position. Sometimes they edged down, sometimes they brought to, says the English admiral, who was carefully watching their approach, in no regular order, as if undetermined what to do. Still Suffren continued on, and at 2 P.M., having been carried 25 miles away from his port, his line being then partly formed and within striking distance of the enemy, the signal was made to come to the wind to correct the order before finally bearing down. A number of blunders in executing this made matters worse rather than better, and the commodore, at last losing patience, made signal 30 minutes later to attack, following it with another for close action at pistol range. This being slowly and clumsily obeyed, he ordered a gun fired, as is customary at sea to emphasize a signal. Unluckily, this was understood by his own crew to be the opening of the action, and the flag ship discharged all her battery. This example was followed by the other ships, though yet at the distance of half cannon shot, which, under the gunnery conditions of that day, meant indecisive action. Thus, at the end, and as the result of a mortifying series of blunders and bad seamanship, the battle began greatly to the disadvantage of the French, despite their superior numbers. The English, who had been retreating under short and handy sail, were in good order and quietly ready, whereas their enemies were in no order. 7 ships had forereached in rounding to, and now formed an irregular group ahead of the English van, as well as far from it, where they were of little service, while in the centre a second confused group was formed, the ships overlapping and masking each other's fire. Under the circumstances, the entire brunt of the action fell upon Suffren's flag ship and 2 others which supported him, while at the extreme rear a small ship of the line, backed by a large frigate, alone engaged the English rear; but these, being wholly overmatched, were soon forced to retire. A military operation could scarcely be worse carried out. The French ships in the battle did not support each other; they were so grouped as to hamper their own fire and needlessly increase the target offered to the enemy. So far from concentrating their own effort, 3 ships were left, almost unsupported, to a concentrated fire from the English line. Time passed on, and our 3 ships, engaged on the beam by the centre of the English fleet, and raked, enfiladed by van and rear, suffered greatly. After 2 hours the Hérault sails were in rags, all her running rigging cut, and she could no longer steer. The Illustre had lost her mizzen-mast and main-top-mast. In this disorder such gaps existed as to offer a great opportunity to a more active opponent. "Had the enemy tacked now," wrote the chief of staff in his journal, "we would have been cut off and probably destroyed. The faults of an action in which every proper distribution was wanting are summed up in the results. The French had 14 ships engaged; they lost 82 killed and 255 wounded. Of this total, 64 killed and 178 wounded, or three-fourths, fell to 3 ships. 2 of these 3 lost their main and mizzen masts and fore topmast; in other words, were helpless." This was a repetition on a larger scale of the disaster to 2 of Hughes's ships on the 12th of April; but on that day the English admiral, being to leeward and in smaller force, had to accept action on the adversary's terms, while here the loss fell on the assailant, who, to the advantage of the wind and choice of his mode of attack, added superiority in numbers. Full credit must in this action be allowed to Hughes, who, though lacking in enterprise and giving no token of tactical skill or coup d'oeil, showed both judgment and good management in the direction of his retreat, and in keeping his ships so well in hand. It is not easy to apportion the blame which rests upon his enemies. Suffren laid it freely upon his captains. It has been rightly pointed out, however, that many of the officers thus condemned in mass had conducted themselves well before, both under Suffren and other admirals; that the order of pursuit was irregular, and Suffren's signals followed each other with confusing rapidity; and finally, that chance, for which something must always be allowed, was against the French, as was also the inexperience of several captains. It is pretty certain that some of the mishap must be laid to the fiery and inconsiderate haste of Suffren, who had the defects of his great qualities, upon which his coy and wary antagonist unwittingly played. It is noteworthy that no complaints of his captains are to be found in Hughes's reports. 6 fell in action, and of each he speaks in terms of simple but evidently sincere appreciation, while on the survivors he often bestows particular as well as general commendation. The marked contrast between the 2 leaders and between the individual ship commanders on either side makes this singularly instructive among naval campaigns, and the ultimate lesson taught is in entire accordance with the experience of all military history from the beginning. Suffren had genius, energy, great tenacity, sound military ideas, and was also an accomplished seaman. Hughes had apparently all the technical acquirements of the latter profession, would probably have commanded a ship equally well with any of his captains, but shows no trace of the qualities needed by a general officer. On the other hand, without insisting again upon the skill and fidelity of the English subordinates, it is evident that, to whatever it be attributed, the French single ships were as a rule incomparably worse handled than those of their opponents. 4 times, Suffren claims, certainly thrice, the English squadron was saved from overwhelming disaster by the difference in quality of the under officers. Good troops have often made amends for bad generalship, but in the end the better leader will prevail. This was conspicuously the case in the Indian seas in 1782 and 1783. War cut short the strife, but not before the issue was clearly indicated. The action of September 3, like that of July 6, was brought to a close by a shift of wind to the southeast. When it came, the English line wore and formed again on the other tack. The French also wore, and their van ships being now to windward, stood down between their crippled ships and the enemy's line. Toward sundown Hughes hauled off to the northward, abandoning the hope of regaining Trincomalee, but with the satisfaction of having inflicted this severe retaliation upon his successful opponent. The firmness of mind, which was not the least of Suffren's qualities, was severely tried soon after the action off Trincomalee. In returning to port, a 74, the Orient, was run ashore and lost by mismanagement, the only consolation being that her spars were saved for the 2 dismasted ships. Other crippled masts were replaced, as before, by robbing the frigates, whose crews also were needed to replace the losses in battle. Repairs were pushed on with the usual energy, the defence of the port was fully provided for, and on the 30th of September the squadron sailed for the Coromandel coast, where the state of French interest urgently called for it. Cuddalore was reached in 4 days, and here another incapable officer wrecked the Bizarre of 64 guns in picking up his anchorage. In consequence of the loss of these 2 ships, Suffren, when he next met the enemy, could oppose only 15 to 18 ships of the line. So much do general results depend upon individual ability and care. Hughes was at Madras, 90 miles north, whither he had gone at once after the late action. He reports his ships badly damaged, but the loss was so evenly distributed among them that it is difficult to justify his failure to follow up the injuries done to the French. At this season the monsoon wind, which has come for 4 or 5 months from southwest, changes to northeast, blowing upon the east coast of the peninsula, where are no good harbors. The consequent swell made the shore often unapproachable, and so forbade support from fleet to army. The change of the monsoon is also frequently marked by violent hurricanes. The 2 commanders therefore had to quit a region where their stay might be dangerous as well as useless. Had Trincomalee not been lost, Hughes, in the condition of his squadron, might have awaited there the reinforcements and supplies expected soon from England, for although the port is not healthy, it is secure and well situated. Bickerton had already reached Bombay and was on his way now to Madras with 5 ships of the line. As things were, Hughes thought necessary to go to Bombay for the season, sailing, or rather being driven to sea by a hurricane on the 17th of October. 4 days later Bickerton reached Madras, not having fallen in with the admiral. With an activity which characterized him, he sailed at once, and was again in Bombay on the 28th of November. Hughes's ships, scattered and crippled by tempest, dropped in one by one a few days later. Suffren held Trincomalee, yet his decision was not easy. The port was safe; he had not to fear an attack by the English fleet; and on the other hand, besides being sickly during the approaching monsoon, it was doubtful whether the provisions needed for the health of the crews could be had there. In short, though of strategic value from its strength and position, the port was deficient in resources. Opposed to Trincomalee there was an alternative in Achem, a harbor on the other side of the Bay of Bengal, at the west end of the island of Sumatra. This was healthy, could supply provisions, and from its position with reference to the northeast monsoon, would permit ships to regain the Coromandel coast sooner than those in Bombay, when the milder ending of the season made landing more practicable. These simple considerations were not, however, the only elements in the really difficult problem before Suffren. The small results that followed this campaign must not hide the fact that great issues were possible, and that much might depend upon his decision. Owing to the French policy of sending out reinforcements in several small bodies, not only was there much loss, but great uncertainty prevailed among the scattered commands as to conditions elsewhere. This uncertainty, loss, and delay profoundly affected the political situation in India. When Suffren first reached the coast, the English had on their hands not only Hyder Ali, but the Mahrattas as well. Peace with the latter was signed on the 17th of May, 1782, but owing probably to an opposition party among them, the ratifications were not exchanged until December. Both there and in the court of Hyder Ali there was division of interest, and representations were made from both to the French, who, though suspicious, could obtain no certain information of the treaty, that everything depended upon the relative military strength of themselves and the English. The presence and the actions of Suffren were all that France had to show: the prestige of his genius, the capture of Trincomalee, his success in battle. The French army, cooped up in Cuddalore, was dependent upon the Sultan for money, for food, and for reinforcements. Even the fleet called on him for money, for masts, for ammunition, for grain. The English, on the other hand, maintained their ground, though on the whole worsted they lost no ships, and Bickerton's powerful squadron was known to have reached Bombay. Above all, while the French asked for money, the English lavished it. It was impossible for the French to make head against their enemy without native allies. It was essential to keep Hyder from also making peace. Here the inadequate support and faulty dispositions of the home government made themselves felt. The command in India, both by land and sea, was entrusted to General de Bussy, once the brilliant fellow worker with Dupleix, now a gouty invalid of 64. With a view to secrecy, Bussy sailed from Cadiz in November, 1781, with 2 ships of the line for Teneriffe, where he was to be joined by a convoy leaving Brest in December. This convoy was captured by the English, only 2 of the vessels escaping to Bussy. The latter pursued his journey, and learning at the Cape of Good Hope that Bickerton's strong force was on the way, felt compelled to land there a great part of his troops. He reached the Isle of France on the 31st of May. The next convoy of 18 transports, sailing in April for India, was also intercepted. 2 of the 4 ships of war were taken, as also 10 of the transports. The remainder returned to Brest. A third detachment was more fortunate, reaching the Cape in May, but it was delayed there 2 months by the wretched condition of the ships and crews. These disappointments decided Bussy to remain at the island until joined by the expected ships from the Cape, and Suffren at this critical moment did not know what the state of things there was. The general had only written him that, as he could not reach the coast before the bad season, he should rendezvous at Achem. These uncertainties made a painful impression upon Hyder Ali, who had been led to expect Bussy in September, and had instead received news of Bickerton's arrival and the defection of his old allies, the Mahrattas. Suffren was forced to pretend a confidence which he did not feel, but which, with the influence of his own character and achievements, determined the Sultan to continue the war. This settled, the squadron sailed for Achem on the 15th of October, anchoring there the 2nd of November. 3 weeks afterward, a vessel arrived from Bussy with word that his departure was indefinitely delayed by an epidemic raging among the troops. Suffren therefore determined to hasten his own return to the coast, and sailed on the 20th of December. January 8, 1783, he anchored off Ganjam, 500 miles northeast of Cuddalore, whence he would have a fair wind to proceed when he wished. It was his purpose to attack not only the coasting vessels, but the English factories on shore as well, the surf being now often moderate. But learning on the 12th from an English prize the important and discouraging news of Hyder Ali's death, he gave up all minor operations and sailed at once for Cuddalore, hoping to secure by his presence the continuance of the alliance as well as the safety of the garrison. He reached the place on the 6th of February. During his 4 months' absence, the failure of Bussy to appear with his troops and the arrival of Bickerton, who had shown himself on both coasts, had seriously injured the French cause. The treaty of peace between the English and the Mahrattas had been ratified, and the former, released from this war and reinforced, had attacked the Sultan on the west, or Malabar coast. The effect of this diversion was, of course, felt on the east coast, despite the efforts of the French to keep the new Sultan there. The sickness among the troops at the Isle of France had, however, ceased early in November, and had Bussy then started without delay, he and Suffren would now have met in the Carnatic, with full command of the sea and large odds in their favor ashore. Hughes did not arrive till 2 months later. Being thus alone, Suffren, after communicating with Tippoo Saib, the new Sultan of Mysore, went to Trincomalee, and there he was at last joined on the 10th of March by Bussy, accompanied by 3 ships of the line and numerous transports. Eager to bring the troops into the field, Suffren sailed on the 15th with his fastest ships, and landed them the next day at Porto Novo. He returned to Trincomalee on the 11th of April, and fell in with Hughes's fleet of 17 ships of the line off the harbor's mouth. Having only part of his force with him, no fight ensued, and the English went on to Madras. The southwest monsoon was now blowing. It is not necessary to follow the trivial operations of the next 2 months, Tippoo being engaged on the other side of the peninsula, and Bussy displaying little vigor, while Hughes was in superior force off the coast. The affairs of the French on shore went from bad to worse. Suffren, having but 15 ships to 18 English, was unwilling to go to leeward of Trincomalee, lest it should fall before he could return to it. Under these conditions the English troops advanced from Madras, passing near but around Cuddalore, and encamped to the southward of it by the sea. The supply ships and light cruisers were stationed off the shore near the army, while Admiral Hughes with the heavy ships anchored some 20 miles south, where, being to windward, he covered the others. In order to assure to Suffren the full credit of his subsequent course, it is necessary to emphasize the fact that Bussy, though commander in chief both by land and sea, did not venture to order him to leave Trincomalee and come to his support. Allowing him to feel the extremity of the danger, he told him not to leave port unless he heard that the army was shut up in Cuddalore and blockaded by the English squadron. This letter was received on the 10th of June. Suffren waited for no more. The next day he sailed, and 48 hours later his frigate saw the English fleet. The same day, the 13th, after a sharp action, the French army was shut up in the town, behind very weak walls. Everything now depended on the action of the fleets. Upon Suffren's appearance, Hughes moved away and anchored 4 or 5 miles from the town. Baffling winds prevailed for 3 days; but the monsoon resuming on the 16th, Suffren approached. The English admiral, not liking to accept action at anchor and to leeward, in which he was right, got under way, but attaching more importance to the weather gage than to preventing a junction between the enemy's land and sea forces, he stood out into the offing with a southerly or south-southeast wind, notwithstanding his superior numbers. Suffren formed on the same tack, and some manoeuvring ensued during that night and the next day. At 8 P.M. of the 17th, the French squadron, which had refused to be drawn to sea, anchored off Cuddalore and communicated with the commander in chief. 1,200 of the garrison were hastily embarked to fill the numerous vacancies at the guns of the fleet. Until the 20th, the wind, holding unexpectedly at west, denied Hughes the advantage which he sought, and finally on that day he decided to accept action and await the attack. It was made by Suffren with 15 ships to 18, the fire opening at 4:15 P.M. and lasting until 6:30. The loss on both sides was nearly equal, but the English ships, abandoning both the field of battle and their army, returned to Madras. Suffren anchored before Cuddalore. The embarrassment of the British army was now very great. The supply ships on which it had depended fled before the action of the 20th, and the result, of course, made it impossible for them to return. The Sultan's light cavalry harassed their communications by land. On the 25th, the general commanding wrote that his mind was on the rack without a moment's rest since the departure of the fleet, considering the character of M. de Suffren and the infinite superiority on the part of the French, now that we are left to ourselves. From this anxiety he was relieved by the news of the conclusion of peace, which reached Cuddalore on the 29th by flag of truce from Madras. If any doubt had remained as to the relative merits of the two sea commanders, the last few days of their campaign would have removed them. Hughes alleges the number of his sick and shortness of water as his reasons for abandoning the contest. Suffren's difficulties, however, were as great as his own, and if he had an advantage at Trincomalee, that only shifts the dispute a step back, for he owed its possession to superior generalship and activity. The simple facts that with 15 ships he forced 18 to abandon a blockade, relieved the invested army, strengthened his own crews, and fought a decisive action, make an impression which does not need to be diminished in the interests of truth. It is probable that Hughes's self-reliance had been badly shaken by his various meetings with Suffren. Although the tidings of peace sent by Hughes to Bussy rested only upon unofficial letters, they were too positive to justify a continuance of bloodshed. An arrangement was entered into by the authorities of the two nations in India, and hostilities ceased on the 8th of July. 2 months later, at Pondicherry, the official despatches reached Suffren. His own words upon them are worth quoting, for they show the depressing convictions under which he had acted so noble a part. God be praised for the peace, for it was clear that in India, though we had the means to impose the law, all would have been lost. I await your orders with impatience, and heartily pray they may permit me to leave. War alone can make bearable the weariness of certain things." On the 6th of October, 1783, Suffren finally sailed from Trincomalee for France. Stopping at the Isle of France and the Cape of Good Hope, the homeward voyage was a continued and spontaneous ovation. In each port visited the most flattering attentions were paid by men of every degree and of every nation. What especially gratified him was the homage of the English captains. It might well be so. None had so clearly established a right to his esteem as a warrior. On no occasion, when Hughes and Suffren met, save the last, did the English number over 12 ships; but 6 English captains had laid down their lives, obstinately opposing his efforts. While he was at the Cape, a division of 9 of Hughes's ships, returning from the war, anchored in the harbor. Their captains called eagerly upon the admiral, the stout Commodore King of the Exeter at their head. "The good Dutchmen have received me as their savior," wrote Suffren; "but among the tributes which have most flattered me, none has given me more pleasure than the esteem and consideration testified by the English who are here." On reaching home rewards were heaped upon him. Having left France as a captain, he came back a rear admiral, and immediately after his return the king created a 4th vice admiralship, a special post to be filled by Suffren, and to lapse at his death. These honors were won by himself alone. They were the tribute paid to his unyielding energy and genius, shown not only in actual fight, but in the steadfastness which held to his station through every discouragement, and rose equal to every demand made by recurring want and misfortune. Alike in the general conduct of his operations and on the battlefield under the fire of the enemy, this lofty resolve was the distinguishing merit of Suffren; and when there is coupled with it the clear and absolute conviction which he held of the necessity to seek and crush the enemy's fleet, we have probably the leading traits of his military character. The latter was the light that led him, the former the spirit that sustained him. As a tactician, in the sense of a driller of ships, imparting to them uniformity of action and manoeuvring, he seems to have been deficient, and would probably himself have admitted with some contempt the justice of the criticism made upon him in these respects. Whether or no he ever actually characterized tactics, meaning thereby elementary or evolutionary tactics, as the veil of timidity, there was that in his actions which makes the mot probable. Such a contempt, however, is unsafe even in the case of genius. The faculty of moving together with uniformity and precision is too necessary to the development of the full power of a body of ships to be lightly esteemed. It is essential to that concentration of effort at which Suffren rightly aimed, but which he was not always careful to secure by previous dispositions. Paradoxical though it sounds, it is true that only fleets which are able to perform regular movements can afford at times to cast them aside. Only captains whom the habit of the drill ground has familiarized with the shifting phases it presents can be expected to seize readily the opportunities for independent action presented by the field of battle. Howe and Jarvis must make ready the way for the successes of Nelson. Suffren expected too much of his captains. He had the right to expect more than he got, but not that ready perception of the situation and that firmness of nerve which, except to a few favorites of nature, are the result only of practice and experience. Still, he was a very great man. When every deduction has been made, there must still remain his heroic constancy, his fearlessness of responsibility as of danger, the rapidity of his action, and the genius whose unerring intuition led him to break through the traditions of his service and assert for the navy that principal part which befits it, that offensive action which secures the control of the sea by the destruction of the enemy's fleet. Had he met in his lieutenants such ready instruments as Nelson found prepared for him, there can be little doubt that Hughes's squadron would have been destroyed, while inferior to Suffren's, before reinforcements could have arrived; and with the English fleet it could scarcely have failed that the Coromandel coast also would have fallen. What effect this would have had upon the fate of the peninsula, or upon the terms of the peace, can only be surmised. His own hope was that, by acquiring the superiority in India, a glorious peace might result. No further opportunities of distinction in war were given to Suffren. The remaining years of his life were spent in honored positions ashore. In 1788, upon an appearance of trouble with England, he was appointed to the command of a great fleet arming at Brest; but before he could leave Paris he died suddenly on the 8th of December, in the 60th year of his age. There seems to have been no suspicion at the time of other than natural causes of death, he being exceedingly stout and of apoplectic temperament. But many years after, a story, apparently well founded, became current that he was killed in a duel arising out of his official action in India. His old antagonist on the battlefield, Sir Edward Hughes, died at a great age in 1794. Chapter 12.